Did I see somebody out there? John, I thought I saw some movement. John, go ahead, John.
So is it even possible ever to recognize liberation if constraint doesn't exist for all of you? So if you don't recognize the box you're in, how do you ever work outside of the box?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think
I'm sitting here envious of women who for 400 years had to wear those things.
the corsets.
Corsets. Because there's a way of understanding that constraint and then being liberated from that constraint.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you didn't know any different, right?
If you didn't know the constraint,
then what
how would
it be?
liberation manifest itself?
Yeah. And I guess, yeah. I guess I'm just thinking about that relationship back to my making and the box that I put myself in when I'm making, which is very constricted. But that's what we were kind of talking about earlier, of like when do you let go without that. But if you don't let go, you never know that that what actually exists, right? And I think that's what happened through the history of the dress reform movement and women starting to kind of free themselves of this. They were realizing that, oh wait, I don't have to do that. So maybe it comes from questioning, of what you actually have or what you're, and then thinking about it and questioning it. Do I need to have this? I don't know. I'm just riffing here. Like I'm not sure. Like, is there?
Before the next one.
No,
do you want to? Okay. You first.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This is more just an observation, but one thing that I really enjoy about the work is how the organic nature of the work seems to operate as a symbol or a sign of liberation. And you think about like the way the organic things just kind of resist control, right? So if you don't tend your garden, you lose it. And there's this moment when you think about the corset of something that was meant to contain the organic reality of human beings, right? And so like when it's stretching or breaking apart or these things are growing or other things kind of have like a plant-like nature, it feels like, and this kind of relates back to the Alice in Wonderland.
I like that. Yes.
You know, it's like this, that's the, like that organic nature is the moment of liberation. As you guys are talking about, like, this is something that...
So I find that really interesting, because then what you're saying is that it's precisely the breaking away from uniformity, regularity, repetition that signifies we're leaving culture behind and nature's taking over.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
So that would enable us to look at, say, the bifurcations in a different way, is what you're saying.
But when I look at this, inside is hollow, right?
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
all hollow. So I don't really find this constrict. This
Yeah.
you can just kind of, or nothing. You're not constricting anything. Really, in actuality, this is just illusion, right? Because nothing's in there.
And this is Lynn's, but you regard that as a richness.
Well, I'm not putting a value judgment in
Yes.
it. I just find it, there's this, it's not like it's elongated and it's got open space. And every one of these, there's a sense of reaching, and the tentacles could be an unwinding of the very tightly wound basket type weaving there. So I think you could play with both. I mean, there are,
Sure.
you know.
You can look at the fabric, the material, and you say, yeah, it looks like something that's constricts things. But like I said, I think it doesn't. I think this is the problem of all things, right? There's always opposite. I mean, this is what problem we're dealing with all the time, right? There's always opposite.
It's called dialectic.
Right? So anything,
In terms of opposites, there's a kind of feeling, once you understand what you're doing, there's a kind of ugliness to the constriction, and there's great beauty to the whole process. And that brings me back to what I really wanted to say, which was that the initial question, when you were asked the initial questions, I felt like you were answering them like most artists when they're being really honest to answer questions, which is referring to and discussing your process. That every initial question before you got dragged into the philosophy was about your answer involved process. And I'm sort of curious that it's clear that you discovered these toys to play with, these tools to make art with, and that you were enjoying using these tools. And at what point, prior to developing the tools or after having the tools and working with them a while, did it occur to you that they had these qualities of constriction and this kind of painful feeling and great beauty at the same time, and your grander theme about women?
Yeah. No, great. Yeah, I was drawn to this material just because of the material meaning of it being boning, and that it was actually what gives a garment structure. And that was the first place where I started with this. And I've been working with this material for a little bit over 10 years. I'm also one of, the process art movement, I would say. I'm very one that's with materials and letting process and material meaning kind of go along with it too. And it's something that I'm still learning from the materials, which is kind of amazing to me. And it's still kind of keeping me going, because you're right. You said it very beautifully. These are tools, I just say, that I've developed and kind of figuring out, this stuff comes in a roll, and it's about this thick, and then, at first I was just sewing them together, and then I was like, oh, what if I could weave them? And then, it's when being with the material, and then also, of course, I'm reading and doing my research on the side, and then I'm thinking about ideas of how I can start to bring that to the material. But my initially just starting with it was really the material meaning. And I think that's my background, as being, studying fiber and textiles too. It's very material based. And so I always approach making with that in mind. If that answers your question.
At the back. Yes. Miss Strombos.
What is the boning? I mean, what is the material?
So this is a polyester boning, so it has a plastic in the inside, and then it has a polyester casing around it. And it's stiff, but it's still flexible. And again, it's what gives corsets contemporarily. This is a contemporary kind of boning. Before it was actually made out of boning.
It was.
Yeah, it's out of whale boning.
Whale bone, yes.
Steel. It evolved in many different ways. But yeah, so this is, it's also stuff that underneath skirts that they give garments, any kind of structure. Even in collar shirts, there's usually those little pieces of boning that go in to make sure that you have your collar in too.
Where do you get it?
I buy it in bulk from a store. And there's something about, I have people that question me about the materials too, of like, oh, why am I not making my own boning? Because the work is also about labor. And I also want to be able to bring in that aspect to it too, of labor, women's work, that conversation to be there. But there's something for me that's interesting, that it only comes in 2 colors, and it comes in this size too. So again, constricting myself to, this is what is actually what I can get to actually make it into.
It's quite a discipline then.
Yeah. Might have control issues or.
No, but to work with something that's constricting.
Yeah, no, it was, and it was. I mean, I physically feel it, and but I also think there's something really interesting about that, and I think there's also why I'm still drawn to the white and the pureness too, and constantly have to be paying attention through my making too, of making sure that everything is crisp and clean, and there's
What's
Is
the
it-
color? Black.
Don't you know? Don't you know? Marcia and then Michelle?
You know, this work is really amazing.
Yes.
Because for me, it resonates with the contradiction of East and West. Not merely a situation of women in constriction. You know, George Clinton, he said, here's my way to dance my way out of my constriction.
You've got to get moving, yes.
And that's a very profound statement that he and the Funkadelics made at that time, because they were coming through a process of their years of conformity with extremely ordered suits,
Yeah.
with bespoke kind of men's European style suits. And when that group made this decision, and I was a Detroiter here at that time when that took place, to see their breaking out of the constriction of the Europeanness of the suiting, and to even be liberated into just a sheer diaper on stage,
Yeah.
was so powerful. And when I see this work, it makes me think of that. It makes me think of the constrictions demanded by Europeanism and the relative freedom, physical body freedom, allowing out of the African and Eastern cultures from a point of view of clothing and garments. And I feel that this work is a reflection of a lot of that.
It's a fascinating comment.
It's beautiful work.
Annica?
Thanks. No, I like it. This is what I wanted to have with this work. I feel like I'm getting emotional because I love that I want people to see it and be able to relate to it and see it in different contexts beyond just the way that I intended it to. And I love that it opens up and you can see it in these different ways.
Before we come to the back, Michelle?
I really just had a comment about the notion of constriction being over in women's fashion, and in fact it's not. More than ever, we are, constricted by yoga pants and space. Exactly. Everything is encouraged to be constricted because
And the Spanx.
we need to be smooth and attractive.
Yeah.
So it's still very
I mean,
much
yeah, and that's the thing that I question too, like how far have we come?
right.
So that's.
Thanks did come to mind.
Please, and then we'll come over. Please go ahead.
What you have created is very creative and beautiful. And for me, I think about what you said about the corset, how long ago it began to now, and it is this piece represents how can I say it? How far fashion and art has come for women. It is a tribute to women and fashion, and to where it has evolved to and where it started from with the corset.
Thank you. You've been waiting, sitting in the window.
I think I'm going a little further than Marcia, but I'm sorry I came in late, so this might be covered, but it's interesting to think about particularly these forms along the wall, like as related to the body, like seeing, it can be very literal, but like vein, sinew, very fallopian.
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of becomes farcical because then it sort of leads you to imagine like the innards being dressed and the absurdity of that. And it goes absurd, and that's what I really like about it.
Yeah.
I think I agree, because one of my reactions was I find some of these quite surreal. And I ran into Annica a few days ago, and I said that there's some surrealist photographs by Man Ray that are, you don't know, nobody knows what they are, and they look these incredibly exotic, inconceivable shapes, but in fact they were three-dimensional mathematical objects. But they work because you were not supposed to know unless you were a mathematician, and I was thinking of that. So I find them really amazingly surreal. Yes, sir.
Just a quick comment, because we were talking about East versus West and Western culture, etc. But the Eastern and African cultures have also equal practices of constriction,
Absolutely.
especially in female bodies.
Yes.
So the Eastern practice of foot binding.
Yes.
And then, in African cultures, there's this. I can't remember where exactly it's from, but I've seen it. Where women have to wear increasing numbers of neck collars to essentially push the. They make it seem like your net is longer, but really what it's doing is pushing your collarbones down. But even something that I found out relatively recently, even pre-Columbian American cultures, I think past maybe Mayans, they actually had a practice of constricting the baby skulls so that they would become elongated, and because that was a sign of beauty and status. So when young children and even babies were constantly constricted and wrapped, so that their skulls and their heads would grow in this very unnatural form. But that was also, and that was for men actually, which is, to me, interesting in terms of a historical example, because most of the historical examples that we have tend to be of essentially cultural modifications of women's bodies instead of men's.
There are cultures, you're right, but there are cultures where it's the men who go through, be it scarification.
There's the craziness of, like, it's not done any longer, and very
Yes.
few were ever circumcised. And such an unusual thing.
But then, does that suggest then that it's not just a question, anthropologically speaking, it's not just a question of, say, the liberation of female restrictions, but it's to do with the liberation from artificiality of certain ideas of beauty. That this is a widespread phenomenon, whether it's the feet, whether it's the neck, whether it's the head, the skull. Might it be that what we're looking at is not just Western misogyny, but what we're looking at is what cultures have traditionally done universally in the name of ideals of beauty. I mean, I'm putting that maybe to the audience as well as to our guests.
What I think, and I think that these beautiful works do this too. I mean, there's two kinds of restrictions. There's physical restrictions, and then there's mental, emotional restrictions, which are sometimes invisible to everyone, including ourselves. And one of the things about this work, I feel like it references both. I mean, those demons that they nip at you sometimes, but you don't know quite what they are. Dreams or some things. Those restrictions that you just you're not aware of, unconscious, and there's something about this work that I really feel straddles both arenas.
Yes.
I have a sense that one of the restrictions that we are heir to is the restriction of gravity. Because in these figures right here, that elongation that you were talking about is so visible in these pieces that hang from the ceiling and have these emptiness, the long strands, as if they were being pulled down through gravity. And looking over at the other ones, it feels like a struggle, like they're struggling somehow, to me anyway, struggling against gravity. twisting and curling. Just a comment.
No, I mean, it's something that I do think about is the gravity, the weight, but also the hollowness, right? And how can these things kind of start to have a conversation?
Kate?
Well, I was just going to say that the thought of struggle also, I was thinking about that earlier too, because you struggle with the material from time to time. I mean, frequently it sounds like it's a struggle, and then, there's a release because you just decide to go with how the material is moving you to go. But, I love because they look like legs to me. I can't see the bottom of them, but, it's just sort of like they're breaking out and becoming free form. And at other times they're very, taut, and there's a struggle there. There's a struggle for you as the artist, but also a struggle intrinsic to the piece.
It seems like, this material, so as you have struggled with your material, right, it's a reflection of our struggle with our body, right? Limitation of our body, right? So the thing is that no matter what the restriction that comes to our body, though, we find a way out. I mean, there's always that space that it's spirit. I mean, it's like body and spirit kind of. So to me, it seems like it's giving us how much we get the limitations imposed on our body. We come out. We create. We come out around it. We survive around it. We find a way out. There's always way out. I really, it's kind of really, it's interesting. More and more I sit here, more and more I find it's really beautiful. It's kind of really interesting. Just kind of, I keep finding more and more. Yeah,
I agree.
It's just the first time I've seen this work, but more I keep sitting here and just looking at this, just other angles keep showing.
Just a
Motion?
practical.
Yes.
How do you do them?
How do I make them?
Are they done on some form of loom? Are they free form? Or do you use an implement?
I create a loom, pretty much. So I'm like, you'll see these at the top, you can kind of see, so there's a warp and a weft, kind of. So I pull down the warp.
By
It's kind
hand?
of coming, but yeah, I'm sewing them at the top, and then I'm weaving them this way. So I feel like every time I'm doing it, I'm setting up a loom. Being from fiber, I also a weaver too. So with all these structures, it's very going back into that practice of weaving again for me too. And they kind of exist in the world, I think, of weaving and basketry too, kind of combining these two. I think a lot about when fiber in the 70s became just not a craft, and it became seen as contemporary art. And it was really when they got off the loom, and when they started doing things three-dimensionally, or hanging a tapestry just a little bit off the wall, right, instead of on the wall. And then the conversation started to kind of come in of it being art and not just craft. So those are some things within my making I'm thinking about too, of referencing my past within that and being true to it and trying to push it too.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about your reading also, is that I've seen the show before and am seeing it again, and the work lives differently the second time you see it. I read your passage a while ago, and hearing you read it again, it also lived differently. It opened up, and I really appreciate the fact that rereading is like looking at art again.
Again. Very much so. Sure. Paulina, and then down here. Paulina, and then down here. Lady
I'm
here.
interested in the materiality of it, the boning, because traditionally I'm seeing it less in terms of constriction, but in strength. You add boning to add support and weight to a garment, and form and structure, which is strength. So I see it, and then they're so soft, and the forms are soft in their actual format. So it's a soft strength, which is a feminine approach, because they are still really they're holding their own weight in its own materiality.
of the artist. And so when I'm listening to you, you said that it wasn't necessarily intentional to create the feminine form, because I can see a waist line in most of it.
Yes.
I'm just thinking that the constriction then that although you're free within your realm, you're kind of constricted within your energy. Does that make sense? That you're fashion forward, so the fashion is exhibiting forward with your art, even though it wasn't intentional. So it's still that constriction concept of being what is of you. That's you, your energy, your passion, your, you know.
Yeah, I guess I do want to say, but that was intentional. the silhouettes, making sure that it comes in the waist, the measurements. I mean, that one's called 18 inches, which was the ideal waist size in the Victorian era. So the measurements in that they are.
Okay, so the ones to the right, because I see like a feminine form per se.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Yes.
very intentional.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. It's just, I guess the unintentional is where it's where maybe I can't control the material, or that sometimes I have to change things. But the silhouettes, yes, this was all very intentional. I mean, I might have not wanted these to be on an angle. I might have wanted them to be straight. So there's little things like that might happen. But the shape and the silhouettes are very intentional. I want you to see waist. That's great. Like I want you to see. I always think about measurements, because also being a garment maker and a seamstress, I'm always thinking about the bust, waist, hips. These are the ways that we define silhouette, and these are always the basic measurements that I need to actually make a garment too. Yeah. You're good.
Kate, again?
Yeah, I kind of also think, look at how more recent acceptance and expansion, if you will, of gender fluidity is going to impact this kind of conversation. I don't know if it does or how it does, but it just seems to me kind of an interesting thing to consider.
No, and that's something that the fashion is really trying to go towards too. So I think you're right. There's some really interesting things there.
Also, all of the things that have been mentioned in terms of constriction, the heads of Mayan men, the constriction of feet in Chinese women, corsets even, all have to do with class as well as fashion, and they're an underpinning. Even corsets, I think, even though they've existed for such a long time, have an underpinning of the fashion of an elite structure and a class structure.
Absolutely.
I mean, you couldn't get into a corset without having somebody put you in it. Which was called tight lacing, which is a whole other process to put it in. So that right there meant that you could have somebody dress you, right? So there is class goes into that.
And the same with the head binding in Mayan culture was only done by the elite.
Yes.
Although Mrs. Padman and Daisy had to wear corsets down in the basement in Downton Abbey as a historical reference.
Well, when we start quoting Downton Abbey, it's time to wrap up. Annica, the first thing is just thank Annica for a really tremendous show. Thank you very much. And Lynn, thank you for wonderful reading. Christina, thank you for hosting this evening. And guys, thank you all. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm so glad you read that one too. I love that.